Hello and welcome to this virtual session. We're glad you can join us today. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping items we'd like to go over with you now. Firstly, you can resize the webinar windows to cater to your viewing preferences. You can maximize, minimize, and drag the windows to your preferred viewing size. If you look at the bottom middle of your screen, you can click on the widgets that you'll need to get the most out of this virtual experience. Secondly, Microsoft specialists are on hand to answer your questions in real time. So feel free to type in your questions using the Q&A window and we'll answer them as soon as we can. Lastly, we've provided some additional resources for you to supplement your learning. You can access them by clicking on the links in this section. Without further ado, I'll hand over to our speakers.
Hi and welcome to this Azure Virtual Training Day where we're looking at implementing hybrid cloud. So this virtual training day is made up of 5 sessions that will occur across 2 separate sort of partitions. In the first partition, we're going to do 3 sessions. And the first of those sessions, we're going to look at an overview of what hybrid cloud is so that you can understand all of the high-level components that connect your on-premises resources to Azure. In the second session, we're going to look at implementing hybrid identity and hybrid networking. So all of the components that allow you to connect this to that, and all of the components that allow you to have a consistent identity experience. The final part of this first partition is going to be about hybrid cloud compute workloads and how you manage those. Anyway, look, I hope you really enjoy this virtual training day. And now we're going to move into the first session. Now, the first session, what's that about? Well, as I said, and let me give you a bit more context about that. This first session is about how we look at all of the components at a high level that exist within a hybrid cloud infrastructure. So let's get into the material. This session is an overview of hybrid cloud. So the aim is to give you that general overview so that you have a map of the territory ahead of the things that we're going to cover in the next couple of modules. This is unashamedly an introductory level module. So if you're looking for a bit more meat, you're going to get those in the other modules in this session. And in this session, we're going to be bringing up a bunch of examples. And the examples are sort of conceptual examples that allow you to understand how you can use hybrid technologies to solve problems that your organization has. Because one way to think about hybrid cloud is that hybrid cloud is an extension or an upgrade or a set of improvements that you can make to your on-premises infrastructure. Hybrid cloud's not about replacing what you've got with the cloud. It's about integrating what you've got in the cloud. All of the technologies that we're going to talk about in these examples are going to be fleshed out in far more detail by the later modules in the learning path, or of course you can go into docs.microsoft.com or the appropriate MS Learn modules. The idea behind these narrative examples is to provide you with sort of a bit of a break between talking specifically about concepts, but also to allow you to think about these technologies in a slightly different way. Rather than me just presenting on a technology and then giving you an example of the technology, the idea behind this presentation format is to give you an example of a problem and then how we can solve it with a specific technology. Because once you understand a problem that something solves, you understand the technology a lot better, rather than describing the technology, for example, going all the way into describing how a wrench works before talking about the need to tighten some nuts. Okay, all sessions in this learning path are going to use the Tailwind Traders fictional company. Now, you don't need to really know a lot about Tailwind Traders other than they've got a central office and they've got branch offices, and those branch offices are spread across cities in multiple countries. Now, even though they're spread across multiple countries, they've got a single Active Directory domain services forest. and branch offices are connected to one another using a single hub and spoke topology, with the head office being the hub and VPNs and direct connections coming in from the spokes. Now, Tailwind Traders has been around a while. That means that they've got a substantial amount of resources on-prem, and they're not going to start, especially in these times, splurging cash on completely transitioning to the cloud. They're going to continue to require their on-prem Active Directory for the foreseeable future, and on-prem Active Directory should be the primary source of identity. What they're going to do, though, is that they're going to adopt technologies in the cloud where it makes sense, and they want to be able to connect to those technologies in the cloud in a hybrid fashion. So let's talk about the Tailwind Traders hybrid strategy. They're a multinational. They've got, let's say that they're in Australia and New Zealand and Singapore. They've got an on-premises deployment. However, that on-premises deployment's been around for a while. They've got aging infrastructure, and their infrastructure is running close to capacity. They've got space in a colo facility. They don't want to hire more racks. They've got servers that they've had since 2008 or 2012, and they don't want to go and buy new equipment if they don't have to. However, they're slowly and steadily growing. Not at a rapid rate, just in a nice, slow, steady rate. And rather than buy those extra racks, rather than expand their on-prem capacity, they're sitting there thinking, you know what we might do is we might extend things into the cloud so that the cloud becomes our buffer. And if we know that we need something, well, then maybe we bring it on-prem or maybe we keep it in the cloud. We're going to see how this thing works. So they want to enhance that on-premises deployment with appropriate cloud technologies. What they don't want to do is they don't want to pick up an existing server that's working perfectly well and just shift it to the cloud because a consultant told them that that's an awesome thing to do. Sometimes it is an awesome thing to do, but sometimes that on-prem server that works really well should be kept on-prem. But new servers, well, instead of going out and buying hardware for them, maybe you go and run those in the cloud. So Tailwind Traders is really, and this is the core of this idea of hybrid, looking to achieve an optimal balance between their workloads, existing workloads hosted on-prem, and new workloads hosted in the clouds, or where it makes sense, moving a workload from on-prem to the cloud. In this session, we're going to cover the following topics. We're going to come up with a definition of hybrid cloud. And everybody's kind of got their own one, but we'll work with a functional definition here. We'll talk about a variety of hybrid cloud architectures. There are many, many, many ways to do hybrid cloud. There's certain ones that are reliable. There's certain ones that we know that work, and they've been codified as architectures. We'll talk about the elements that make up most hybrid clouds. We'll talk about the tools that you can use to manage and govern your hybrid cloud. We'll talk about some of the things that you need to think about if you've got data in the hybrid cloud. And we'll also hit some challenges and really reinforce that hybrid cloud or any adoption of technology isn't all upsides. There's other things that you need to consider. There's things that you need to be aware of. And sometimes in these sort of sessions that they can only give you the good bits and they won't say, well, here's some of the drawbacks as well. You've got to understand the balance that you're striving for. So, what is a hybrid cloud? From the perspective of Microsoft Azure, a hybrid cloud is a stable state, not a transitional state, but a stable state where an organization will host some workloads on-prem and other workloads in Azure. So this is an important statement. We're not talking about hybrid as a transitional state. We're not saying that hybrid is the road that you're on between on-prem and the cloud. We're actually saying that hybrid cloud is a destination where you're getting the best of both worlds. In a hybrid cloud environment, you've got resources on-prem, and those resources on-prem are able to communicate securely and seamlessly with resources in the Azure cloud. So what that means is that the communication between the elements of this cloud, be it on-prem or be it in an Azure data center, have secure communication. It's not something where someone can easily go and intercept that communication or interrupt it or modify it. In a hybrid cloud, you have a consistent identity infrastructure for authentication and authorization. Now, what that means is it means that you're not using a separate set of accounts to authenticate against cloud resources compared to the accounts that you use to authenticate on-prem. Now, it might be that you have a single identity provider. Most likely, given that this is Microsoft, it's going to be something like Active Directory. But what you're not doing is you're not doing what used to happen at a place I worked in the 90s, where each system that the staff interacted with required a separate set of login credentials. And people had to keep notebooks around to look up what the credentials were for a particular system that they were interacting with. If they were enrolling students, they looked at one thing. If they were doing faculty finances, they were doing another one. In a hybrid cloud, you've got a consistent identity. If you need to authenticate against a web app on-prem, you use that identity. You use the same identity to authenticate against a database running in the cloud. Now, the other thing about a good hybrid cloud is that you've got a consistent set of tools that allow you to manage on-prem and cloud workloads and infrastructure. What does this mean? It means that, again, you don't need to pull out a different toolbox if your stuff's on-prem compared to the toolbox you pull out if your stuff's in the cloud. In the best of all worlds, you're using a single tool to manage workloads on-prem or in the cloud. And in the best of all worlds, you don't really need to know if the workload's on-prem or in the cloud. You're just using the tool to manage it wherever it is. Now, the other thing and the final thing in this particular definition of hybrid cloud, and there's other definitions out there. This isn't certainly something formalized by something like NIST. It's that you have a consistent set of technologies used to secure your on-prem and cloud resources. So just as I said, you don't have a different toolbox for managing on-prem as opposed to managing the cloud. You have a single toolbox in terms of your security tools to manage or to secure on-premises and cloud resources, that you can assess the security of your resources, or you can be alerted to infiltration or security misconfigurations using a single set of tools for on-prem and cloud, rather than, again, having to go, well, I need to know if there's a security alert. I'll look at my cloud security alerts and they're over in this box, and I'll look at my on-prem security alerts and they're over in that box. Okay, so now that we've got that definition out of the way, let's look at one of Tailwind Traders' challenges. So they've currently got Windows Server virtual machine workloads that are dependent on Active Directory domain services, which is fairly common. A lot of people obviously have AD and they've got Windows Server VMs. Now, in this particular case, these workloads are dependent on an Active Directory schema customization, and that this application or these workloads are present at various branch offices. Now, these workloads are running alongside virtualized DCs on aging virtualization host hardware. I mean, maybe they took Windows Server 2012 R2, put Hyper-V on it, and then put a bunch of VMs there. And this hardware is getting near end of life, working for a certain amount of time before you'll start seeing an increasing number of failures. The reality is, for Tailwind Traders, the workers in these particular branch offices still require access to these workloads. One of the things that Tailwind Traders has looked at is they thought, well, could we migrate or centralize this? And because Tailwind Traders is a multinational organisation, it doesn't make sense to move these workloads too far from where they're already currently located. Okay, so with those challenges in mind, what kind of solutions could we use hybrid with? Well, one of the things that we could do is we could connect each Tailwind Traders branch office to Azure using a VPN or express route. A VPN, virtual private network, is an encrypted connection that runs over the internet. Express route is a high-speed fibre optic connection that runs straight over a private link that doesn't cross the internet into an Azure data center. So what Tailwind Traders could do is they could deploy brand new Windows Server IaaS VMs, that's a virtual machine that runs in Azure, and configure those VMs as domain controllers, and then configure a new Active Directory site in the existing domain to represent that Azure data center. They could move those VM workloads from the aging virtual machine hosts out at the branch offices into the Azure virtual networks that have got the IaaS VM domain controllers. So basically what they're doing is they're replicating that infrastructure that exists on-prem at the branch offices and moves it into the cloud. And that's a case where, okay, the aging virtualization infrastructure doesn't need to be replaced, and the virtual machines are still able to interact with that custom schema. Because there's certain situations where people move stuff into the cloud, and unless they replicate those schema changes, they're not going to work with those VM workloads. So let's look at an example hybrid deployment. In this particular image, you can see that we've got the on-prem network, and we've got a connection to a gateway subnet, and on the on-prem network, we've got our Active Directory domain controllers, and that our on-prem network does have a perimeter network that's got a public IP address. Now, the gateway subnet runs through to the application subnet. There's a separate subnet on that virtual network that hosts the domain controllers. And those domain controllers are able to replicate and be part of the same domain or the same forest, depending on how you configure it, as the domain controllers on-prem. And if they're part of the same forest, they can have exactly the same custom schema extensions, just replicate as part of that forest. There's no need to come up with a separate infrastructure and then modify the structure of the schema in the cloud. Or at some point you could do that. It just depends. But that's one particular hybrid scenario or hybrid solution for that specific set of circumstances. And as we'll look at in future sessions, if, for example, those workloads did have an Active Directory dependency, but they didn't require the custom schema extensions, well then maybe another option would be appropriate. Maybe we could domain join them to an Azure Active Directory domain services domain, which allows you to virtualize domain controller as a service. And we'll get into that sort of situation in the next session in this virtual training day. So let's talk about hybrid cloud architectures. Microsoft publishes and updates hybrid cloud architectures on docs.microsoft.com. To understand what a hybrid cloud architecture is, it's sort of a best practice solution for a specific problem that you might have. It gives you a reference way of solving the problem. It doesn't mean that's the only way of solving the problem, but what it does is it gives you a look. If you've got this particular scenario, this is how you can take an off-the-shelf solution and start to tinker with it by yourself. And in the slide is a screenshot of the hybrid cloud architectures page. Inclusive in the existing hybrid cloud architectures, and more are being added all the time, we have architectures such as how to manage configurations for Azure Arc-enabled servers, how to use Azure automation in a hybrid cloud environment, how you can use Azure file shares in a hybrid cloud environment, how to use Azure automation update management to manage your updates, how to use hybrid file services so that you've got file servers on-prem and in the cloud, how to use hybrid security monitoring with Azure Security Center and Azure Sentinel, how you can run containers in a hybrid environment, how you can extend on-premises Active Directory Federation services through to Azure, how you can manage hybrid cloud workloads using Windows Admin Center, that is, manage your workloads on-prem and in the cloud, how you can implement a hub-spoke network topology with the cloud, given your existing network infrastructure, how you can use Azure Arc hybrid management and deployment for your Kubernetes clusters, how you can connect an on-prem network to Azure, that one's obviously a fairly basic and straightforward one, how you can scale your on-prem workloads into the cloud, how you can integrate your on-premises AD domains with Azure Active Directory, and how you can configure Active Directory domain services resource forests, that is, where they host resources, not accounts, in Azure. Okay, so let's get on to the next challenge. And in this challenge, when we're thinking about how hybrid works, we're looking at web applications. So Tailwind Traders has branch office perimeter networks that host web applications in multiple countries that they wish to decommission. Now, I'm sure you're aware of this, but if you've kind of forgotten how this works, basically a lot of organizations have got perimeter networks, sometimes called DMZs, that sit there and they host web applications, and people connect over the internet to those web applications, and the web applications do something related to the business. Now, perimeter networks are expensive to maintain, not just because of the equipment, but the moment you basically in some way allow inbound traffic to your network, even if it's sitting on a perimeter network, you've got a whole lot of questions and you've got a whole lot of decisions that you need to make about security. So one of the other things that Tailwind Traders knows is that several weeks a year, when they run an online retail campaign, those applications can simply get overwhelmed with traffic and fail. And this annoys customers, it annoys management, and it of course annoys IT because they get blamed for it all. So one of the things that Tailwind Traders wants to do is they want to make sure that during those periods where they're going to be hit by massive traffic, they can cope with it. But what they don't want to do is they don't want to go and put in place massive infrastructure to deal with something that's only a problem less than 5% of the year. The other thing that they want to do is they want to put in OWASP filtering and distributed denial of service protection for their web apps. And they don't want to be sitting there managing complex perimeter network firewall systems. One of the things that they've learned is that occasionally people would run denial of service attacks against their applications during one of these retail campaigns, which meant that the websites went down faster. So what can they do about that? Well, solutions exist within hybrid. What Tailwind Traders can do is that they can move all of those perimeter network web applications and host them on networks in Azure. In fact, Azure and the cloud is really well suited to the migration of perimeter network applications. Instead of hosting the perimeter network adjacent to your on-premises network, what you do is you move your perimeter network up to the cloud and you allow the cloud to handle all of that. And then you've got a VPN or an express route connection up to that network itself. Remember, if you've put it in a perimeter network, it is an externally facing application. So it's really suited to running in the cloud. Now, you can protect applications from attacks that are on the OWASP top 10 list. So what's the OWASP? It's basically a list of the top most common types of attacks that are run against web applications. And you can also protect against distributed denial of services, basically by putting in place Azure technologies such as distributed denial of service protection and web application firewall. If you go and put these web apps in the cloud is purpose-built to allow you to scale up and down as your traffic fluctuates. You can configure a web app so that if it starts to hit a certain number of requests, bang, it adds more instances to that, or it adds more powerful instances to that so that it handles the traffic. And as the traffic disappears, the web app shrinks itself back down so that it's running in the most efficient and, more importantly, the cheapest way possible. So let's talk about the elements of a hybrid cloud solution. Your hybrid cloud solution needs to have management, identity, networking, security, and fabric when you think about it. So from the management perspective, make sure you've got a consistent set of management tools to manage on-prem and cloud workloads. Now, when we're talking about Windows Server heterogeneous networks, that is, that you might have some Linux there, you'll have already figured out a way to manage your Windows Server and your Linux workloads on-prem. What you don't want to have to do is pick up a third set of tools to manage your workloads in the cloud. What you want to do is you want to use the same set of tools to manage your workloads on-prem and in the cloud. So with Windows Server, you can use Windows Admin Center to actually manage on-prem and Azure workloads. You can use Azure Arc to manage the configuration of all your Windows servers and your Linux servers on-prem or in the cloud. For identity, you want to use a single identity provider for authentication and authorization. Now, that might be straightforward, bog standard Active Directory that you run on-prem, or you might move everything to Azure Active Directory. If you've got Office 365, you're already using Azure Active Directory, because what's happening is that you've already got identity synchronization where people are logging in to Office 365 using their on-prem accounts that are replicated up from your on-prem domain controllers. Your networking needs to be secure and reliable. You need to have a way of making sure that you can connect your on-prem network to Azure. What you don't want to do is you don't want to have everything on your on-prem network initiating its own independent connection through to the cloud. You want to set up a secure pipe, be that an express route connection or a VPN connection, to allow that communication to occur. And it needs to be reliable. So you need something that's actually supported by the cloud provider. You need to have a single set of tools to monitor and respond to suspicious activity. Now, luckily, you've got Azure Security Center and Azure Sentinel, and these can be used to ingest security data and analyze security data from on-prem and cloud resources so that you can go into Azure Security Center or into Azure Sentinel and you can actually look at one console and you can see security telemetry from your on-prem and your cloud resources. The other thing is that you need to make sure your on-premises fabric is managed and maintained as consistently as the cloud fabric. Now, this is a bit unusual when you're thinking about hybrid, but this is more an exploration of where Microsoft is going. And what I mean by that is in the public cloud, you don't worry about managing the fabric. And what I mean is, for example, if you're running a web application or if you're running a database on Platform as a Service, you don't actually worry about managing the underlying infrastructure. And with products such as Azure Stack HCI, you can actually have your on-prem infrastructure managed by Microsoft. Let's talk about that a bit more. So the Azure elements of a hybrid cloud solution. For management, you can use the Azure portal and Azure Arc, the Azure CLI and Windows Admin Center. So you can use the Azure portal, especially when you've got Azure Arc configured, to do management of on-prem resources. For identity, you've got a variety of options that come with an Azure hybrid cloud solution. You can use Azure AD. You can use Azure Active Directory Domain Services, and you can use Azure AD Connect. And that's all without getting into complex topics such as identity federation. For networking, you've got Azure VPN and Azure ExpressRoute as the products that you use to connect your on-premises resources to Azure. What you don't need to do is you don't need to go, wow, how am I going to connect my on-prem to the cloud? I know what I'll do. I'll spin up my own VPN appliance in the cloud, and I'll spin up a VPN appliance on-prem and I'll connect them that way. No, well, we've got VPN as a service with Azure. So you're just connecting into that VPN as a service. For security, as I mentioned, you can use Azure Sentinel, which is a security incident and event management solution, or a SIEM, or a SIM, depending on how you say it. You've also got Azure Security Center. So Azure Sentinel is a way of looking at all of your events and then running queries using Jupyter notebooks against those to find suspicious activity. Azure Security Center is sort of a pre-built set of configuration alerts and best practices and ways of assessing your infrastructure. So if you want to know that if you're compliant with a particular security standard, such as PCI DSS, you can use Azure Security Center to do that. And in terms of Fabric, there is an increasing number of products available from Microsoft in the Azure Stack range. You've got Azure Stack HCI. Now, what does Azure Stack HCI do? Well, instead of you managing your entire virtualization infrastructure all yourself, where you're installing new Hyper-V servers and you're managing and configuring those Hyper-V servers, what you do with Azure Stack HCI is it's basically a box or a bunch of boxes that you put in your data center where Microsoft is responsible for managing all of the configuration of that infrastructure, and all you worry about managing is the actual virtual machines themselves. And then you've got Azure Stack Edge, which instead of just doing the VMs, which you do on Azure Stack HCI, Azure Stack Edge allows you to run those web apps and all of those Azure services on-prem. So if you're in a situation or a disconnected data center situation, let's say that you're in a submarine or on a cruise ship where you still need to run the sorts of applications that you'd run on platform as a service in the cloud, well, you can run them on-prem. But in that case, Microsoft is responsible managing the infrastructure and you're just responsible for managing the applications. So let's come back to a challenge for Tailwind Traders. So Tailwind Traders needs to keep a large number of VMs on-prem, but has noticed that maintaining the virtualization fabric that hosts those virtual machines is increasingly challenging. Now, downtime occasionally occurs because the process of applying operating system updates, device driver updates, and firmware updates is a complicated task for hyper-converged virtualization infrastructure. Okay, so how do they solve that? Well, let's go back to what we talked about before. Azure Stack HCI would provide Tailwind Traders with an option of a fully managed virtualization infrastructure, where Tailwind Traders IT operations only has to worry about virtual machine workloads and doesn't have to worry about managing and maintaining the infrastructure that supports those workloads. Now, many organizations have already started the move towards a hybrid posture. And as I have mentioned earlier in this presentation, the thing about hybrid when you do it properly is that it improves, it enhances your on-prem deployment. As I said, lots of organizations have already got hybrid cloud. If you've got M365 technologies such as Exchange Online, Teams, or are already using Azure web applications, you're already hybrid. So it's already natural for most organizations to actually understand that they already have a hybrid deployment. And you can be incremental about a hybrid deployment. One of the things that people get wrong about the cloud is they get this idea in their head that it's an all or nothing proposition. You can be hybrid. You can have a little bit of cloud or you can have a lot of cloud depending on what you need. What your organization should always do is choose the appropriate cloud technologies that are going to make your organization successful, while still keeping those things on premises that you need to keep on premises. So another challenge. Now, Tailwind Traders looked at their infrastructure and they did an audit of their Windows Server and Linux workloads, both on-prem and in the cloud, and found that 30% didn't have the most recent software updates installed. Because Tailwind Traders has multiple branch offices spread across multiple geographies, it can be very difficult to make sure that absolutely everything is kept up to date. It depends who owns the workload. Sometimes in organisations that are very geographically dispersed, you get some workloads that are absolutely kept up to date and other workloads that are basically left without being patched. I can't tell you how many organisations I've gone into where the first thing I do is just check, have you got software updates done? And it's usually not just 30% of server workloads that don't have the most recent updates installed. So one way of Tailwind Traders addressing this problem, a hybrid way of Tailwind Traders addressing this problem, is using Azure Automation Update Management. And this is another way of thinking about how the cloud or how the hybrid cloud can work in your environment. Because in a hybrid solution, what you can do is you can have your management layer that does all of your monitoring running in the cloud, and you can keep all of your workloads still on-prem. With Azure Automation Update Management, as you can see in this image, you can have Linux and Windows workloads on-prem, as well as workloads running in the cloud, and that you can have one pane of glass, which just basically means one console, to manage updates and compliance for all of those operating systems. So looking at Tailwind Traders' next challenge. As with all of us, they've got to make sure that they're compliant with particular standards. And recently they took a long time and a lot of money auditing their configuration of their Windows Server and their Linux workloads to determine if they had drifted from a baseline security configuration that ensured that they were compliant with a bunch of standards such as ISO 27001 or PCI DSS 3.2.1. So how can hybrid cloud help with this? The hybrid solution for this problem is that by using Azure Arc, by using Azure Policy, by using Azure Security Center, Tailwind Traders is able to basically perform an audit on the configuration of workloads and determine whether or not they are compliant with a particular set of security standards. They can then remediate those workloads and ensure that they are compliant. So it's possible in a hybrid cloud scenario to centrally assess the compliance of your workloads. That's something, of course, you can do on-prem, but again, it comes back to this idea of when you adopt a hybrid cloud, that you sort of sit there and you go, you know what we can do? We can actually have our management layer in the cloud where we go and assess all of our workloads, and then we go in and drill down and fix those non-compliant workloads. Now, in terms of hybrid cloud management and governance, Azure Arc and Azure Policy can be used to ensure your hybrid workloads are configured in a specific manner. For example, in a later session, you will see how it's possible to use Azure Arc and Azure Policy to determine whether or not Windows Server VMs are configured to automatically update their anti-malware definitions. You can use role-based access control in a hybrid environment to ensure that only authorized users are able to perform specific administrative actions. Role-based access control is assigning permissions to a specific scope. And in a hybrid environment, you can be very detailed about your scope. You can put your scope as an individual virtual machine or all virtual machines that are running in your environment. Or you can do it to a group of virtual machines or to an app or a group of apps or so on and so forth. Tagging you can use to find workloads related to a specific project. One of the other great advantages of a hybrid cloud is it allows you to simply organize all of your workloads a lot easier. If you've just got an on-prem environment where you've got virtual machines sitting on hypervisors every which way and every which branch office that you've got, it can be very difficult to work out who those workloads belong to. In fact, there has been research that's done that suggests that up to 30% of virtual machines that are running in the world are actually zombie workloads. That is, that they're workloads that don't belong to anybody, that they were spun up and forgotten about. Tagging's really great, and through Azure, by integrating it with Azure Arc in your hybrid environment, you can start to apply tags to all of your workloads, both on-prem and in the cloud, so that you can do a quick search to find where a particular workload works. Now, there's other products that do this, but this is another way that hybrid can make your on-premises infrastructure better. Okay, so another challenge for Tailwind traders. Like everybody, they've got file servers. In fact, file servers are the most common type of server in the world. And file servers have a problem. People keep creating new files and they very rarely delete old ones, which means file servers tend to run out of space. And what we all do as IT pros, as administrators, is often we sit there and you go, well, file servers run out of space again. What are we going to do? We need to go and muck out. We need to go and remove old files and put them into long-term storage and just hope that no one's going to ask for those files at some point in future. Because occasionally you get someone saying, oh, look, I left a particular file on a particular directory 3 years ago and I can't find it. Can you go and find that for me because we need it for this new project? File share replication also can cause a lot of problems. Anybody that's implemented DFS on their WAN has found that certain branch offices don't get updated, that there's conflicts, and there's always a whole lot of problems. Well, there is a solution within a hybrid environment, and that's called Azure File Sync. We'll go into Azure File Sync in more detail in a later session, but the idea with Azure File Sync is that you turn it on for your file shares, and then your file shares are automatically replicated up to the cloud. And the cloud keeps a copy of everything. But it's a bit like OneDrive, where with OneDrive, you can basically have you can say, keep this in the cloud, and all it does on-prem is put a little placeholder, and then when you click on the placeholder, it replicates it down from the cloud. Well, if your file sync's sort of like that, and instead of it being like OneDrive, which is just for your client, Azure File Sync works for your server. Anyway, you'll learn more about that in a later session. If Tailwind Traders implements Azure File Sync, they can turn on cloud tiering, and they could turn on Azure File Sync to automatically tier any file that hasn't been accessed for 30 days. So with OneDrive, you've got to do it manually. You've got to say, hey, let's put this folder up into the cloud. With Azure File Sync, it'll say, hey, you haven't touched this for 30 days. Bang, I'm automatically going to go and tier that for you. And if you're a user accessing that file on the file share, you've got no idea whether or not it's been tiered or not. But if you try and open it, what happens is it syncs back down from the cloud and then opens normally. You can also have additional file servers, so that file servers all across Tailwind Traders deployment across multiple countries can all have a copy of the same file share. You have a source of truth sitting in the cloud that holds everything. Because remember, cloud file shares can be as big as you want. Your on-prem file shares might only be a couple of 100 gigabytes in size. You can also configure the file share to be backed up every day. And instead of doing the backup on-prem, you just run the backup in the cloud. And if someone deletes a file, well, you come back and you recover it in the cloud, and then that recovered file is available to all instances of that file share. In terms of data in the hybrid cloud, think about it this way. One of the ways that hybrid cloud can really make things better for you is that storage in the cloud is cheap and functionally limitless. I mean, not in reality limitless, because you can't put an infinite amount of data up there. But the cloud can act as a store for as much data as you can throw at it. You can put it on colder storage, slower storage, and when you put it on slower storage, it's cheaper to keep, but you can keep a lot of it there so that you can access it when you need to. It might take a little longer to pull down, but you can keep as much data as you want in the cloud. That's a lot more efficient than sort of the old way we used to do it, where we put it on tape and then ship the tape off to an archive facility. And Azure File Sync can be automatically configured to tier cold data that no one's using anymore, to an Azure file share, so it's easy and cheap to store. Okay, so we're going to finish this introductory session with a set of best practices and some challenges. So let's start with the best practices. Make sure you're using a consistent set of management tools for your on-prem and cloud workloads. You don't want to have to become an expert in lots of different tools to be able to manage your hybrid environment. You should manage your hybrid environment in a consistent manner. Make sure that consistent security policies are applied to hybrid workloads. It shouldn't be that your workloads in the cloud are really secure and your workloads on-prem are any which way but loose. You should make sure that the same security policies apply to on-prem and to the cloud, that your Linux machines are configured in a certain way, a certain secure manner on-prem and in the cloud, and your Windows machines are configured in a certain way that's secure on-prem and in the cloud. Make sure that backup and disaster recovery is configured for all of your workloads. Don't assume that because you deploy something in the cloud that it's automatically being backed up. It's a big mistake a lot of people make. You know when it's on-prem that you've got to back it up. Why? Because you've learnt the hard way that if you don't back it up on-prem and it fails, you've got no other options. But the same thing can apply in the cloud. And we'll have a session later on about talking about backing up and disaster recovery in hybrid environments. Make sure you track workload costs on-prem and in the cloud. There's tools that allow you to do it in the cloud, but you should also be aware of what your costs are on-prem. When someone asks you how much it costs to run a server or a virtual machine workload on-prem, you should have a ballpark figure in mind to provide them with. You just can't shrug your shoulders and say, I don't know, because then someone will come back and say, well, let's move everything to the cloud, because if you don't know how much it costs on-prem, maybe it's cheaper in the cloud. And maybe it is, but maybe it's not. You need to know how expensive it is to run things on-prem so that you can make a comparison as to how expensive it is to run things in the cloud. Finally, there are some challenges that come with running a hybrid cloud. When adopting a hybrid cloud, make sure that the environment doesn't become so complicated that you can't manage it. There's a thing called cloud sprawl. That is that people get to the cloud and suddenly they can find that they can deploy as much stuff as they want. And that's great until you need to keep track of it all. So you make sure that you limit what can be deployed so that you can maintain it, you can manage it, and you've got a good map of what you've actually got. Make sure that workloads are going to be hosted in the appropriate location from the perspective of cost, governance, and compliance. Don't be like some people who decide, oh, you know what, I'm going to go and put that data in that VM, and I'm going to run that VM in that data center overseas, only to find out that the data within that virtual machine is only allowed to be kept within the country, and that by moving it to a virtual machine that's hosted in the cloud in a data center overseas, you've actually broken some local laws. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, and this is very important when people talk about how moving to the cloud makes things cheaper if you do certain things. Migrating a virtual machine is only the first step in migrating a workload to the cloud, and we do have a completely separate virtual training day on cloud migration. It is eventually necessary to migrate the application to a platform as a service to take full advantage of what the cloud offers. That means instead of running a monolithic application sitting in a VM, you eventually want to get to the stage where it's running as an Azure web app, or as a container, or as a set of functions, or serverless. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. Okay, in that session, we went through an overview of how hybrid cloud works. We're going to take a break for 10 minutes, and then we're going to get into how hybrid network infrastructure and identity works. Hope to see you there.